I have looked after the village hall for 31 years, and in that time, I have learned that the most important people at any gathering are very often the ones nobody thought to invite. I knew Silas Webb long before that night. He kept a small holding on the rise above the river, 3 fields and a stone barn and a house that had needed painting since his wife died. Margaret Webb passed 11 years before, and after that Silas more or less disappeared from the life of the village. He still came down for his groceries on Thursdays, still nodded at you on the lane, but he stopped coming to the things, the feats, the carol services, the harvest socials. People stopped expecting him, and then, the way these things go, they stopped noticing his absence at all. I noticed, because every winter I'd walk past his gate on my way to check on old Mrs. Aldous and see his light on, just the one lamp, and think, there he is, still going. I never knocked. Perhaps I thought a man who wanted company would come down for it. So you can imagine my surprise when, on the night of the harvest social, I looked up from the trestle table, where I was setting out the urns, and saw Silas Webb standing just inside the doorway of the hall, in his good coat, the collar a little too wide for his neck now, holding his cap in both hands like a boy waiting to be told where to sit. Nobody had sent him an invitation. I knew that for a fact, because I had written out everyone myself, and his name had not been on the list. He must have heard about it from someone in the shop, or seen the notice in the window, and decided, after 11 years of not deciding such things, to come. The hall was already filling. We had borrowed 2 chandeliers from the manor for the occasion, and they threw a buttery light over the long tables and the rows of folding chairs, and over the upright piano against the far wall, polished for once, a little garland of autumn leaves draped along its top. The evening was Mr. Bertram Coyle's idea, as most things in our village were that year. He had moved into the old rectory 2 summers before, made his money in shipping, and had taken it upon himself to be the patron of every event the parish put on, which mostly meant he stood near the front and told people what was about to happen. He was doing exactly that when Silas came in, explaining to a cluster of guests, in the carrying voice of a man used to being listened to, that he had arranged for a small ensemble from the county town to come and play after supper. Something a cut above the usual, he said, with a laugh that made clear he thought the usual was a fairly low bar. I went over to Silas and asked if he'd like a cup of tea, and he said that would be very kind, and he found a chair near the piano, not at it, just near it, the way a man might sit near a fire he has no right to warm himself at, and he sat with his cap on his knee and his tea going cold and watched the room fill up around him. About an hour in, with supper cleared and the room settling into that restless lull before whatever comes next, he caught sight of Silas sitting quietly by the piano, and something about it seemed to needle him. Perhaps the old coat, perhaps simply a face he didn't recognize among guests he considered his own. He crossed the room with that particular smile some men have, the one that looks like warmth from a distance and turns out up close to be something else. "Now then," he said, loud enough that the nearby tables turned, "we can't have anyone sitting idle while we wait for the proper entertainment, can we?" He gestured at the piano with an open hand as though presenting it as a kind gift. "Why don't you give us something while we wait, mister?" He paused, not knowing the name, and didn't ask for it. Just play something simple, nothing fancy, just to fill the gap before the real entertainment arrives. A few people laughed, the easy laugh of a room that has decided to find its host amusing. I felt my face go hot on Silas's behalf. Silas didn't flinch. He set down his cup and he looked at the piano for a long moment, not at Mr. Coyle, at the piano, the way you might look at an old friend you hadn't expected to see again. Then he said quietly, "Well, I suppose I could try," and he crossed to it, and sat down on the bench, and the room went on with its low hum of conversation, already half forgetting him, ready for 30 seconds of plinking before the real business of the evening resumed. He sat for a moment with his hands in his lap. I was close enough to see his face, and what I saw there wasn't nerves exactly, though there was something of that. It was more like a man standing at the door of a room he hadn't been into in a very long time, working up the courage to open it. Then he lifted his hands, and he played. The first notes were so quiet that the room didn't stop talking. 3 or 4 notes, slow, almost tentative. A simple melody in the right hand with the left hand, holding something low and steady underneath it, like a hand resting flat on a table. It sounded, for those first few bars, almost like exactly what Mr. Coyle had asked for, something simple, but there was a quality to it that made me put down the tray I was holding. I have heard a great many people play something simple on that piano over the years. Children stumbling through scales for the Christmas concert, the vicar's wife working her way through a hymn. This was not that. The notes were simple, yes, but the way Silas placed them, the tiny hesitations, the way one note seemed to lean into the next, the way the melody breathed. It was the difference between someone reading a sentence aloud and someone who has lived inside that sentence their whole life. The melody turned. It was a small turn, just a lift of a few notes into a higher register, but something in it made the hair stand up on the back of my neck, and I saw, 2 tables over, a woman pause with her fork halfway to her mouth. By the third phrase, the room had gone quiet, in waves, the way a held breath spreads through a crowd. A conversation near the door faltered and stopped. Someone set down a teacup without the usual clink. Mr. Coyle, turning to refill his glass, stopped walking and stood with his back half to the piano, listening, his face beginning to change in a way he clearly hadn't expected. The left hand deepened. What had been a simple, steady foundation began to move, slow rolling chords that filled the bottom of the hall like water filling a basin, and over the top of it the melody grew. Not louder, but fuller, as though it had been quietly gathering itself, and only now had the room's full attention to spend. I recognized the shape of it, distantly, something of Chopin in it, the long singing line of a nocturne, the kind of melody that seems to hang in the air after the note itself has stopped. But it wasn't quite that. It was woven through with another tune entirely, simpler, plainer, the kind you might hum without thinking, walking behind a plow or hanging washing on a line. The 2 melodies moved together, the grand one and the plain one, twining around each other like 2 voices in conversation. And the effect of it was like watching 2 people, after a very long separation, recognize each other across a room. By now, every face in the hall was turned toward the piano. The chandeliers threw their warm light down across Silas's shoulders and across his hands, which moved over the keys with a sureness that had nothing to do with the stooped, careful way he'd carried his teacup an hour before. His eyes were closed. I don't think he knew any longer that any of us were there. The music swelled, not into noise, never into noise, but into something larger, the chords opening out like a door opening onto a wider room, the melody climbing into the piano's higher register, where it seemed almost to catch the chandelier light and throw it back. I heard, beside me, someone draw in a breath that caught halfway and turned into something else. I looked, and it was old Mrs. Aldous, 91 years old, sitting very straight in her chair with tears running freely down her face, and no attempt at all to stop them. I will tell you honestly that I had to set my own tray down on the nearest table, because my hands were no longer steady enough to hold it. The piece reached its highest point, a long, suspended chord, held just slightly longer than you expected, the kind of pause that makes a whole room lean forward without knowing it's leaning. And then, very gently, it began to come down. The grand melody softened, fell back, and what was left, underneath everything, was the plain one, the simple tune, the one you might hum behind a plow. It played alone now, very quietly, very slowly, each note given all the room in the world, and Silas's head bowed slightly over the keys as he played it, as though he were speaking to someone very close, someone only he could see. The last note he played was not loud. It was barely more than a whisper of sound, struck and held, and then released so slowly that none of us could have said exactly when it stopped and the silence began. And then, there was the silence. I have stood in that hall for 31 years, through wedding parties and funeral teas, and every kind of gathering in between, and I had never once heard it as quiet as it was in those first few seconds after Silas lifted his hands from the keys. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed, it seemed. The chandeliers hummed faintly, the way old electric chandeliers do, and that was the only sound in the room. Silas sat very still, his hands resting on his knees now, his head bowed, and for a long moment I genuinely thought, that he might not look up at all, that he might simply sit there until the room emptied around him, the way he had let the village empty around him for 11 years. Then someone, I never found out who, and I have always been glad of that, because it meant it belonged to all of us, began to clap. One pair of hands, slow and uneven at first, and then another, and then the whole room was on its feet, the chairs scraping back all at once, the sound of it filling the hall the way the music had filled it a moment before, except this time it was warm, and it was for him, and it did not stop. Mr. Coyle was on his feet too, He was not clapping at first, simply standing, his glass still in his hand, looking at Silas with an expression I can only describe as a man recalculating everything he had assumed about the evening and about the person sitting at the piano. Then, he set the glass down and he clapped too, and when the applause eased, he was the one who crossed the room first. He didn't say anything grand. I think he understood that anything grand would have been the wrong note entirely. He simply stood beside the piano, and when Silas finally looked up, Mr. Coyle put out his hand and said, quietly enough that only those of us nearby could hear it, I'm sorry. I didn't know who I was talking to. Then, after a pause, what was that? The piece, I mean. I don't think I've heard it before. Silas looked at him for a moment, then down at the keys, and something moved across his face. Not pain exactly, though it had pain in it. More like a man setting down something heavy he'd carried so long he'd nearly forgotten its weight. No, he said. You wouldn't have. My wife and I wrote it. A long time ago, when we were both still playing. She was the singer. I was meant to be the pianist. Before the farm took up all the hours God gives a man. We never finished it properly. I used to play it for her, on winter evenings, after the milking. The tune underneath, that was hers. She used to hum it doing the wash. I don't believe I've played either since she passed. He paused, taking in the hall, the chandeliers, all of us standing there with our hands still warm from clapping. I'm not entirely sure why I played it tonight. I think I simply forgot for a moment that I'd stopped. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Mrs. Aldous, still in her chair, still with the tracks of tears on her face, said, in the carrying voice of the very old, who have stopped minding, who hears them, well, you mustn't stop again, not on our account. And he didn't. He came to the carol service that December, and to the spring feed after, and most things since. Somebody, I have my suspicions, though Mr. Coyle has never confirmed it, arranged for the piano to be properly tuned that winter, and a small brass plate appeared on its lid not long after, engraved with two names I won't repeat here, because they were never anyone's business but Silas's and Margaret's. I still walk up past his gate most winters, on my way to check on Mrs. Aldous, but now, more often than not, I knock. And more often than not, there's a light on, and the sound of the piano drifting faintly through the cold air. Some tune I don't recognize, simple and plain and unmistakably alive. I think about that often, how close we came, all of us, to never knowing any of it. A man sat quietly in a corner with his cap in his hands, and the only thing anyone thought to ask of him was that he fill a gap before the real entertainment arrived, and he did. He filled it so completely that there was nothing left over for whatever was supposed to come after. That, as far as I'm concerned, was the real entertainment. It always had been. We simply hadn't thought, until that night, to look.